I'm not too sure if you've seen these series of articles that have surfaced over the last few days, but they're a giant waste of time, as you would expect. To save you the time and minimal yet delicate effort of clicking on these articles, the titles are both correct and incorrect. I think we can all say Red Dead Redemption 3 was never a question of if, but when. Red Dead Redemption 2 had the largest opening weekend in entertainment history, making over $725 million in revenue in its first 3 days. Only second to guess what? Grand Theft Auto 5, completely blowing all predictions on sale figures out of the water. So while the title didn't enjoy the post-launch support as its Grand Theft Auto 5 predecessor, we can't let that reflect the game's popularity or immense potential for generating massive amounts of revenue and being a long-running heavy hitter for 2K and Rockstar respectively. So the articles basically are just common sense that blows a small comment from Strauss Zelnick, CEO of Take-Two, out of proportion. It's a comment where he states this: "The time it takes to create something phenomenal requires us to be thoughtful and willing to rest the titles, so it becomes a special event." During this same conference, Strauss continues to draw comparisons of Red Dead Redemption and the Grand Theft Auto series to that of the James Bond series, going on to say, if it's really, really great, it will keep going. Obviously not a lot to grasp there. In other words, Red Dead Redemption and Grand Theft Auto haven't shown even the slightest signs of dwindling, appealing to gamers, and therefore they'll continue to press on with those series. What these articles fail to express is something we can easily come up with on our own, and that's these games take 5, 7, sometimes a decade to create. Red Dead Redemption 2's development time is believed to be roughly 8 years, with the earliest concepts of the game's story and characters being discussed immediately after Red Dead Redemption's release in 2010. When you consider that, along with Rockstar having all hands on deck for Grand Theft Auto 6, yeah, we aren't seeing Red Dead Redemption 3 for a while. I'd place my bets on them currently, if anything, in the pre-development stage for the story, and that's about it. No voice actors, gameplay, barely on location to speak of, just the skeletal groundwork for the narrative. And that brings me to the point I want to talk about today. What would Red Dead Redemption 3 even look like? It's such a broad concept. Undoubtedly, it's going to be a massive game. I doubt anyone can argue that. For today's sake, to keep this somewhat short, I don't want to touch too much on gameplay, more so the plot and the place. The two games we have right now explore the years of 1911 and 1914 for the first game. 1911 is the main events of the story, while the epilogue as Jack is during 1914. The second game is set in 1899, with that game's epilogue taking place in 1907. The 1911 and 1914 time period of the original game shows the Wild West seemingly long gone, with the West slowly becoming civilized with laws more heavily enforced. Now, since both games have a pattern of taking place during a particular year followed by an epilogue many years later, the gaps left in between can be further explored if Rockstar so wishes. However, personally, I think it'd be much more beneficial for Rockstar to go further into the past, rather than continue to border on the last dying years of the Wild West. You see, the golden era of the Wild West is from 1865 to 1890, widely considered to be from the start of the American Civil War until many years after its climax. Red Dead Redemption 2 doesn't talk much of the American Civil War, but just because there isn't much direct talk doesn't mean there isn't any representation in this game. There are some old battlefields you can explore, littering the game's landscape, and of course, the Lemoyne Raiders serving as Southern American troops that refuse to lay down their arms. The time span of the American Civil War does provide an incredible backdrop with so many different opportunities to take the story in. For Red Dead Redemption 3, we can see the main protagonist being a soldier in the North or South, creating their own outlaw gang, like the real-life story of the outlaw Jesse James gang, or have the main player take up arms independently, not being an enlisted soldier per se, but someone who uses the Civil War to act out their own criminal tendencies. That manifesting with you killing or robbing neighbors under the guise of them being enemies of the state, supporting the North or South, depending on the shaky stance of the protagonist himself. It doesn't even have to be directly defined. It would be neat to see Rockstar take this approach, ideally landing in 1862 to 1863 at the height of the Civil War, so that if they do decide to make the Civil War be much more prominent in that game, it's during a time where both the North and South are more established, with a decent military presence on both sides, allowing random events in the open world where both sides run into each other, often leading to some type of skirmish. A skirmish that the player can decide who to help, based on their own volition. Now, realistically speaking, I don't think Rockstar will want the Civil War to play that much of a significant role in their next game. Perhaps a figure who survived the war might, but the major event itself, I'm very doubtful. There's also the possibility of Rockstar taking a page out of another Red Dead game in terms of what year to take this game in. Red Dead Revolver is unofficially the first game in the Red Dead series. That game takes place during the 1880s, still considered to be during the height of the Wild West days, albeit towards the end of that era. They could take that era and maybe even reimagine some of the characters and enemies within that game. It's widely believed that they basically did that very thing with John Marston and Red Harlow, with Marston being a much more modern iteration of Harlow. While that's very much a possibility for Rockstar to use the original game as some kind of inspirational blueprint in terms of what direction or time period wise to take that game in, I hope it's narratively a game completely separate from Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2, and has nothing to do with the Van der Linde gang. Now hear me out, I have a reason for this. Now don't get me wrong, there's a lot of exciting opportunities Rockstar can explore with the various characters of the Van der Linde gang. Rockstar can even explore the early days of Dutch, taking the role as him being the main protagonist. We can see through his own eyes the formation of the infamous Van der Linde gang and how he became the core of it. Perhaps along with that, seeing both Arthur and John as troublesome adolescents, now they became in the good graces of Dutch and Hosea. More interestingly, they could even elaborate on the early days of both Dutch and Colm. We could see firsthand how they met, what the relationship was like before and leading up to the death of Dutch's love interest, Annabelle, and then seeing his subsequent retaliatory move of killing Colm's brother as a way to revenge his lost love. They could explore how Dutch and Hosea met and created the gang, shaping them as the men we know in Red Dead Redemption 2. If you think about it, there's quite a bit of material Rockstar can really pull from if they wanted to go the route of younger Dutch as the main protagonist. Alternatively, they can also explore the life of side characters from the Van der Linde gang. Immediate characters like Sadie Adler and Charles Smith actually come to mind. Sadie would actually be very interesting, just to see what it's like as a female bounty hunter in the long gone days of the Wild West. If you recall in the epilogue of Red Dead Redemption 2, Sadie becomes a bounty hunter. Through the progression of Red Dead 2's story, I think Sadie had the most addicting and frankly entertaining transformation. Going from a grieving widow that undoubtedly, or at least very likely, was a law-abiding citizen before the O'Driscolls came and completely ripped her life to shreds, to then see her as the most bloodthirsty member of the Van der Linde gang, at times arguably rivaling even Micah's more careless antics. Earlier I mentioned the fragility of creativity that going later on in time past the 1900s would have in terms of gameplay and the authentic feel of a true Wild West game. So if they were to take the idea of someone like Sadie as a bounty hunter, it would be better to have them use her as a template of sorts, establishing the idea of a bounty hunter in the middle of the Wild West Apex days. That would be remarkably interesting because now you have bounty hunters upholding the law. There wouldn't be any form of centralized wanted system. It's already a little bit fractionalized with how it is in Red Dead 2, with every state having their own specified bounty amount, but maybe they can expand on the system by having multiple factions of bounty hunters, outlaws, or corrupt officials fighting to turn each other in on trumped up charges, or holding court in the streets and finding some weird bureaucratic way to justify it, or even make fun of this civilized system that's slowly making its way over to the West. Now the Red Dead series already has an honor system, a system that's frankly a bit underwhelming. I'm hoping with Red Dead 3 they put a lot more care and attention to detail into this with more gameplay and narrative implications, but just the idea of having corrupt officials and going head to head with other bounty hunters I think would play phenomenally well with that honor system that's basically already there. Now the other interesting character Rockstar could build up on is Charles Smith, half African American, half Native American. Nationalities that were individually discriminated against while being both more likely would have been a death sentence, since you could be an outcast from both the natives, as in their eyes you're a half-breed, and society as you're a mix of both. I believe taking the approach of an Indian or some type of outcast beyond just another outlaw would allow for some creative endeavors by Rockstar, by supplying an even more unique backdrop that's very rarely, if ever, explored. Like Sadie, Rockstar doesn't have to use Charles himself. Instead, they can use a little bit of his own story, going from gang to gang, not knowing his father or parents, living on his own. Charles is a fantastic character that grants a remarkable opportunity to expand on something unique. And similar to the Civil War in Red Dead 2, Native Americans did have a place in that game. It was actually a little bit more direct than anything involving the Civil War or ex-Civil War vets that showed up as Lemoyne Raiders. So Rockstar's already showed a little bit of interest in providing that sense of perspective during that time period. And I would actually love to have that expanded a little bit more on. So instead of even having the Civil War showing from the Native American perspective of actually being at war with the army or surrounding outlaws, and then you just have bounty hunters thrown into the mix, I think would also be a very interesting, exciting premise to provide. Now, Dutch and the gang, as I was saying, are great. However, I think it's time for something new. Personally, I'd say leave the Van der Linde gang and its members to the first two games. Place the game in an earlier time period, have more chaos and open world encounters showcasing people with mentalities in line with Micah. But no matter what, as much as I love Dutch, as much as I love the Van der Linde gang and all their many different characters, I think it's time to kind of separate itself. The Red Dead series isn't based off this particular gang. I think what's most important when it comes to a Red Dead Redemption game is the fork in the road. And let me explain what I mean. Red Dead Redemption was John's story. He was going to do whatever it takes to, in the eyes of the society he so passionately loathed, will carve out a place for himself and his family. A life on the run, murdering and robbing people, wasn't a life for Abigail or Jack. He had to put his family first. He had to grow up. He had to move out of all the basically immoral tendencies that he carried throughout his entire life. His mentality appeared to be a complete 180. We may not know his actions or how he was before the events of this first game at the time, but it was apparent he was willing to do whatever it took to cleanse himself and his family of his sins from his previous life, even if that meant turning on his previous brothers and adopted father. Sadly, despite his hardest efforts, in the end, it was society that still rejected him. The sequel likewise saw an incredible transformation. Arthur Morgan was Dutch's most trusted assistant. He was the beloved son that put his love, respect, and his father Dutch's vision before anything else. It was his blind love, obedience, and loyalty to Dutch that ultimately even got Arthur sick. A sickness that cost him his life. A life that he spent to his dying breath denying what his mentor became. He started reflecting on himself. His actions carried weight. He had a deadline, and it was fast approaching. When it came to duels in the street, fistfights in the bar, taking out rival gangs, Arthur was untouchable. But now, through events far beyond his mortal control, he was sick, and he had to reflect, take a step back, look at himself, and look at those around him that he really cared most about. No matter what, the third installment needs to do this. This is what makes a Red Dead Redemption game. This is what it's famous for. Yes, it's a beautifully crafted, superbly detailed open world set in the American frontier, but our morality, our decisions, our very way of life need to be challenged. Challenged in a way that properly deserves the redemption moniker.